I'm so glad to be here. And I'm going to talk today about language. That's because I was trained initially as a linguist. But in the process, I'll be talking how ideology, in fact, and affects and impacts language in everyday living, and we are often betrayed by that language. But I wanted to start my talk, which I titled Killing Ideology Ideologically, with a quote from Paulo Freire, which goes like this. I quote, "The more I might let myself be seduced by the acceptance of the death of history, the more I would admit that the impossibility of a different tomorrow implies an eternity of the neoliberal today we see now, and the permanence of today kills within me the possibility of dreaming," unquote. Paulo Freire. Then I want to share, as I was preparing my talk, Maya Angelou's, that along the same lines shares in her poem, saying, I quote, "History, despite its wrenching pain, cannot be unlived, and if faced with courage, need not be lived again. Lift up your eyes upon the day breaking for you. Give birth again to the dream. Women, children, and men, take into the palms of your hands. Mold it into shape of your most private needs. Sculpt it into the image of your most public self. Lift up your hearts. Each new hour holds new chances for new beginnings. Do not be wed forever to fear, yoked eternally to brutishness," unquote. Maya Angelou. I thought that these two incredible authors, a poet and Paulo Freire, in a sense speaks very loudly against this fatalistic notion of the end of history and the end of ideology of this fatalism that we are now facing in these dark ages, not only in the United States, but all over the world. But before I submerge myself into the brutishness of our contemporary world, I want to take this opportunity to thank both Henry Giroux and Susan Searle Giroux for their kind invitation for me to be here today to share with you some of my ideas, but also some of my ideals which shape our political project, which has as its main aim that a better tomorrow, as Paulo would say, is possible. Thus, we should commit ourselves to carve a world that is less morally offensive and more just, less dehumanized and more humane. I also want to thank you for your presence today, particularly the students, because I believe that you represent the tomorrow that will lift us out of our current world darkness, where carnage is being normalized, human disposability is naturalized, and fear becomes our raison d'être. While the future generation faces the weight of darkness of our current history and has been saddled, as many of you well know, with unconscious student mortgage that you will have to pay for many, many years, if not 30 years, a dark age where humanity is now determined strictly by market forces, your presence here today confirms for me that there are many of us who dare to say no to the fatalistic view of the world and who are yearning for alternative ways of being in the world and with the world. A world where people dare to proclaim that human misery is not a destiny, but a social construction. Hence, your presence here today, quote, quoting again Maya Angelou, is, I quote, "the image of your most public self. Lift up your hearts," unquote. Let me also take a minute to say that I'm here today merely as an accident of history for many reasons. My guidance counselor didn't want me to go to college because I didn't speak English. And when I met Henry, as you soon will know, I was a psycholinguist teaching language at Boston University. And that psycholinguistic preparation did not prepare me to be it did prepare me to be a very good technician into the cracking of morphemes, but it robbed me simultaneously of the critical ability to make meaning out of the cracked morphemes so as to make linkage with the world that generates shapes and reshapes meaning making. That is, I could crack morphemes, I could conjugate verbs, I could understand tenses, but in most cases, or at least in many cases, I couldn't make the accurate meaning in the accurate and appropriate context, and so as to understand both my location in the world and the location of others as well. While teaching language at Boston University, I met Henry Giroux, with whom I connected instantaneously due to our shared working class values and our distaste for what I think is a suffocating and at times nauseating liberal middle class academics whose political commitment to social justice always is guided and shaped by an ideological weather vane that shifts without notice depending on the ideological wind current of the moment. Henry's father was also a mechanic, and so was I. That's how I put myself to school. And then, because of that fact, I immediately became Henry's personal mechanic, making frequent house calls near Commonwealth Avenue, where he lived, in an apartment that belonged to BU, with my toolbox, while in a very working class way, not middle class, in a very working class way, we began to exchange labor instead of paying for it. Since our miserly, salary from Boston University could not afford us very much, i.e. paying to go to the garage to have his Ford Triumph fixed, which would break down almost every other week, right? So I remember once, while taking apart the brakes in his Triumph, Henry was leaning over me, talking nonstop, trying to refigure his arguments against the school of positivism, theory and cultural resistance, cultural production and reproduction, themes that preoccupied him at that time. I remember vividly how much I wanted my hands not to be full of grease so I could take notes. Luckily, I had a very good memory, and I would go home, take a shower, and begin to write down Henry's ideas, books that he would suggest that I would read, and ponder over many of his theoretical formulations. Needless to say, my coincidental encounter with Henry transformed my life. It is through him that I met Paulo Freire, with whom I had an uninterrupted 15-year relationship and collaboration, translating his books and also co-authoring several books and articles. Henry published my first major article in critical literacy, which was only the beginning of multiple publications that would see the light through his encouragement, mentorship, and friendship, a friendship that has lasted more than 37 years without ever having a falling out, which is not really that common, in the academy, as you know. They hate you sometimes for even writing a book or giving a good lecture or getting an award, much less, maintaining a long-term relationship as we have. Ken Saltman, a mutual friend, many times has asked me, how come you and Henry never had a fight in 37 years, my answer is always the same to him. It happened 2-3 weeks ago again. Neither one of us are careerists whose political project is career advancement, couched in a counterfeit critical and progressive discourse. And we are surrounded by many of those. Both Henry and I understand the meaning of friendship that goes beyond a quid pro quo. Neither Henry nor I were ever seduced by the pretentiousness of the academy, and we both understood very well that there is no such a thing as a working class academic. That is, in order to fully be accepted into the academy, one needs to be willing to give up one's working class ways of being in the world and with the world, and be willing to be whitewashed into an assimilatory middle-class academic life. Finally, Henry and I understood the value of loyalty and friendship, where friendship always trumped a career move, a book published or not, who's going to be the first or second or third author. By rejecting the seduction of the academy, I became a proud godfather of Henry's son, Brady, the best man in his marriage with Susan. And I became an adopted brother to Henry, whose generosity is boundless, by mentoring hundreds of young authors, including myself. I was young at one point, particularly a minority and women who always have had a hard time scoring an academic touchdown in a field where the goalpost is always movable to protect traditions, to exclude minorities and women, to reinforce academic rituals and institutional power. In a nutshell, I am who I am today because of the transformation that I underwent under Henry's tutelage, mentorship, and friendship, and for that, thank you, Henry. Against the glimpse into my personal history, in an era when historical amnesia is encouraged, if not demanded, both on the personal and societal level, I want to use the time that I have left to problematize the neoliberal trap of proclaiming the end of social and human problems when the facts on the ground point to the contrary. It is extremely difficult to end what is in essence unendable, or at least not easily endable. For example, in the past few decades or so, the public discourse has been infested by the empty cliches such as the end of, like a plethora of books have been published proclaiming the end of racism, Danish de Souza, for example, the end of history, the end of ideology, among other ends. Hence, with the fall of the Berlin Wall, authors, pseudo-intellectuals, and political pundits who blindly embrace the virtues of liberal democracy rush to jump on the propaganda bandwagon, declaring, for instance, the end of ideology. What these thinkers fail to realize is that ideology can only be killed ideologically. That is, one's ideology is only ever displaced by and in favor of another, acknowledged or not. These pseudo-thinkers turned commissars supporting the neoliberal world order attempt to disingenuously promote a fatalistic discourse designed to immobilize history so that we can accommodate the status quo. A status quo so aggressively promoted by a neoliberalism that largely supports an obscene greed whereby the ruling class minority accumulates a vast store of wealth while the majority of the world, dispossessed, landless, and exploited, are routinely relegated to subhuman condition and status. Thus, the gulf between the haves and the have-nots in the world is exemplified by the decadent reality in which 63 63 individuals in the world control more wealth than 3.5 billion people in the lower rung of the world, people who live with less than $1 per day. And Henry this morning corrected me that, told me that out of the 63 individuals, 43 of them live in the United States. Imagine that. 43 individuals have more wealth than approximately over 3 billion people in the lower rung of the world wealth. You know, if this is not decadent, name me another form of decadence, you know. And the fact that we don't connect with that reality, that we don't problematize that reality, that we don't critique loudly, or we don't really denounce in order to announce a world that's less discriminatory and more humane, you know, gives me chills when I think about it, particularly coming from Africa, where poverty is all around you. You know, this is all around you. When you see children dying of hunger because they couldn't have breakfast, they couldn't have proper medication, they could not have proper, you know, vaccination, and so on and so forth. So I've seen it, I've lived it, and I am very passionate when I talk about these issues, and I feel these issues in my heart. So in order to guarantee its survival, acceptance, and reproduction, the neoliberal ideology needs to astutely hide its capitalistic evil nature while masking the concentration of wealth of the ruling class minority, and normalize massive poverty and human misery for the vast majority of the people of the world, particularly in the third world, which they cynically label as such third world. And I say cynically because we all know that, in fact, in the first world US society, we do have third worlds like East St. Louis, Detroit, South Chicago, East LA, and so on and so forth. You know, ghettos where human misery, hopelessness, you know, alienation is, you know, is a daily fact of life. You know, thus the term third world, which refers to underdeveloped, I would say developing, always the underdeveloped diminish, you know, and demonize these nations, is misleading to the extent that we know that these third world realities also occur and are present in our first world context, where, for example, oligarchs, like the 63 or 43 people who live here, you know, are often imprisoned in skyscrapers, penthouse with helicopter pads because they're too afraid to freely walk the very streets they have populated with homeless people, alienation, and human misery. That is the case, for example, in Brazil and many Latin American countries, where the rich live, you know, in these type of penthouses that they don't really, you know, move around by cars or never walk, and they basically, you know, go from place to place via helicopters. Brazil is the second country in the world, you know, in terms of private ownership of planes. You know, and I was told by Anita Freirean not too long ago that there's a little city constructed in Brazil where there are no roads, zero roads. You cannot even buy cars. That people, you know, can live in safety. That, you know, in other words, the very people, you know, that have been oppressed, that are now feeling alienation, and then that we call are involved in crime because of their alienation, cannot get there. So then they travel back and forth, you know, from at least the fathers and the mothers who are professionals, then travel back and forth to Avenida Paulista, which basically is this economic center of the entire South America and Latin America, via helicopters. You know, isn't that incredible? In other words, the more you accumulate, the more millions you have, you see, the more imprisoned you are in your very wealth. So this is basically, we are not seeing it, but coming from the third world. I know it exists, I have seen it, and I am seeing now the beginnings of it in many contexts in the US. And I think if things do not change radically, certainly if Donald Trump wins, that reality will be expanded for sure. Thus, for me, then, the insidiousness of the neoliberal discourse resides in its attempt to dehistoricize reality while passing itself as natural, coercing those who are not reaping benefit from the social order to accommodate to it on the grounds that their accommodation or such accommodation is for their own good. It is important that the oppressed remain domesticated by ensuring that they embrace blind faith and retain only a naive view of reality which is in line with the doctrinal and dominant system. That is to say, a reality that cannot be changed. A reality that's a priori predetermined. This fatalistic and deterministic view of the world immobilizes people so as to prevent them from seeing that human misery, as I said earlier, is a product of history, not a destiny. If it is a product of history, it is a social construction. If human misery is socially constructed, we can intervene, in a significant manner to deconstruct the human misery and begin to think of alternatives where, social injustice in a more just society can be constructed. The degree to which the neoliberal discourse has succeeded in preventing a clear understanding of reality does not rest only on the force of ideological manipulation. Its current triumph is directly linked with its policy designed to shrink public spaces where debate can occur and oppositional voices can be heard. The strategy to dissolve public space is heavily directed towards privatization of everything public, including public schools, the media, which right now is totally concentrated in the hand of few corporate, giants in the United States, for example. The attack on the public has successfully targeted schools and universities, causing the atrophy of public spaces for debate that could animate a substantive democracy and critical citizenship. For example, public universities in the US are now public in name only, since the state only minimally funds them. Take the case of our university, the University of Massachusetts in Boston. When I started teaching at UMass Boston, the state funded the university by 70%. Right now, it only barely funds 23%. That is, UMass Boston is mainly funded by student tuition. Whereas across the river, MIT, you all have heard about MIT, an elite institution, university in the area, is funded over 80% by federal and state grants and contracts. Which means that MIT, in reality, is more public than UMass Boston, where I teach. But it's private to the extent that it remained, exclusionary, and it excludes the very public that funds it. This is really incredible. It's not only incredible how the language that is used, using it as a private, nobody ever questioned, is a private school, then they can set their own rules, then they can have an elite posture, then they can have high, high expectation in terms of requirements for you to get in terms of SAT scores and so on and so forth. Now, whereas the poor people, not any longer because of gentrification, but the poor Portuguese folks that live around MIT and surround MIT Portuguese immigrants by and large, and Latino immigrants, that were contributing to funding it in some real direct respect could not have access to it because they would never really, have gone to good schools that would prepare them to basically perform, and achieve the type of standards required by MIT. Now, this is another way that, in fact, ideology works to mediate, and also to get us to accommodate to a reality that's discriminatory, but the language makes us feel that, it's not even in our realm to think of going to MIT since it's a private institution, and whereas, the state and certainly the federal government pay so much more than what they pay to sustain UMass Boston, where I teach. So to me then, this form of critique is often muffled, by the tactic brilliantly used by the neoconservative and neoliberals, which is to position both the media and higher education as ultra-liberal. In other words, if I make this critique, I'm a Marxist. If I make this critique, I'm ultra-liberal. If I make this critique, I'm out of order, so on and so forth, which this critique really deserves to be made. MIT and Harvard, the elite institutions, need to be democratized. So long they want to continue to really, be supported by state and federal funds in some direct or indirect ways. So, and sometimes, in talks like this, then not only they try to muffle me, but they think that I'm anti-American, in trying to make the critiques, whereas my critiques, in my view, is basically to make America more democratic, and basically adhere to its ideal of inclusion, in all levels of society. Thus, for example, once one is inculcated with the belief that Hillary Clinton, for example, John Kerry, remember him, and Dan Rather, who are all hawkish supporters of the illegal war on Iraq, are considered and labeled liberals or liberal politicians who are working against the interests of Americans, and there remains little public space for more progressive left voice to be part of the mainstream discourse. In fact, with respect to higher education, professors like Noam Chomsky, Howard Zinn, Stanley Aronowitz, Henry Giroux, Bell Hooks, Angela Davis, among others, are portrayed as danger enemies of the United States who indoctrinate rather than educate. In other words, engaging in critical analysis of reality is called indoctrination, while a banking approach, a banking model of teaching, of selective fact consumptions, is viewed as natural, neutral, and scientific. So a non-critical course that does not really raise issues, that does not, engage students in critique, that does not create a space for debate, is, normal, natural, and scientific. And if you engage in the type of critique that I'm engaging in right now, I would be considered ideological. I'm teaching the seminar in social linguistics right now, and the major textbook that I'm using, the author even cautions readers to avoid critical linguists because of their ideology. They taint the objectivity of the methodology they use to collect data and analyze data and so on and so forth. So what this author does not realize, page 15, I never forget, this author does not realize the very claim that I am, for example, ideological, constitute already an ideological act. So and this is a book that presents itself, a textbook that presents itself as a progressive textbook that tries to valorize language differences and language variety, such as Black English, for example. Thus, for me, the nomenclature public attached to both radio and television is at best a quaint relic and at worst a misnomer. Central to the neoliberal ideological control is the manipulation and the erasure of language. For example, when Hillary Clinton, John Kerry, and the reporter Don Rather are designated as liberals by the dominant ideology apparatus, it is unviable to have a significant left presence in the mainstream. By mainstream, I mean this term that's used unreflectively, as a yardstick to weed out people, ideas, and ideals that not conform to the white middle class ways of being in the world. I ask my students often, what is the meaning? These are linguists. They're going to get a master's in applied linguistics. I ask them, what is the meaning of mainstream? They often ponder and have difficulty answering. And when they struggle to try to answer that question, they keep pointing more, and they keep inching more and more and more towards white middle class values. So there's not really a definition. So if you think of mainstreams, there are millions and millions of Americans that don't belong or don't fit into that category, i.e. the immigrant, for example. We're not part of the mainstream. But if you think you have a job, you have certain security, or you're not engaged in any type of radicalism, you may think of yourself a mainstream, whereas you know that you're not, because if you try to rent an apartment in the wrong neighborhood, you would be told immediately that this is not the mainstream that we had in mind for you. So then, for me, the label, the media that labels Hillary Clinton as a liberal, for example, the expectation is that our point of reference is the left. So Hillary Clinton becomes the left. So you can't possibly imagine anybody to the left of her. Now, by coincidence, we have Bernie Sanders, and in order to escape that labeling liberal, he calls himself, a socialist democrat, and he does that purposely because he is to the left. But we don't have labels in the United States, for example, as we do in Europe, in Africa, and Latin America, that we try to locate the positions of politicians. So we have, for example, the Republicans, all of them, from Cruz to Rubio to Trump, they are what? Conservatives, you see? But we never refer to Donald Trump, the far-right candidate. Now, neither do we refer, for example, we don't have any, a far left or a hard left candidate in the United States. But that doesn't mean that reporters in the New York Times, the Boston Globe, the LA Times, so on and so forth, don't know the difference. When they are talking about candidates, for example, in countries like Chile, in countries like Argentina, in countries like France, in countries like Brazil, they use the term that they don't use with the US politician. For example, the Associated Press reported, I quote, Bracelet had 62% of the votes to 38% for the center-right Evelyn Matei, who conceded defeat in the presidential election in Chile, So in the same article, it was reported that Bracelet, I quote, has a new center-left coalition and promised to finance education with higher corporate taxes and reduce the wealth gap, unquote. Sounds like Bernie, But do we ever say that Bernie Sanders is center-left, or Bernie Sanders is going to try to develop a coalition with another center-left organization to promote, policies that would basically narrow the gap, the wealth gap between the have and the have-not? No, you will never find that. At least I haven't. So to me then, left candidate to the left of Bernie Sanders, who would be characterized as hard left, in Europe or in Latin America or in Africa, where I'm from, would be unthinkable. Thus, a language to mark the ideological boundaries is unnecessary. See? So in other words, if you cannot think of the political differentiations in terms of the candidates, you don't need a language to name it. So then there's a relationship between the concept and then the language. Then the erasure of language is in essence the erasure of thinking about possibility of the existence of hard left in the United States, of hard right in the United States. And this became very clear as I was doing the research to put this together. On the Republican side, the coverage, for example, functions in the same manner. Reporters may allude to the existence of the right, as the Boston Globe reporter Scott Lehigh, who considers himself a liberal and progressive. In essence, he is a center-right, reporter, and wrote an article titled, I quote, "The GOP versus the right." So one cannot claim that we never see the right or the left being written in a newspaper, although minimally. However, the entire article ends up lumping the right ideological boundaries into one monolithic term, conservative. Thus, Marco Rubio, Jeff Bush, Ted Cruz, and Donald Trump are mostly referred to, in the mainstream media as conservative Republicans. As Lehigh himself summarized, I quote, this is as open a fissure among conservatives as we would have seen in the Tea Party times," unquote. I.e., when we have a far-right candidate or far-right coalition, we don't name it as such far-right coalition. What we do, we come up with a euphemism, Tea Party. But most people don't know what Tea Party, stands for. You see, and they adhere to a single issue raised by the Tea Party, for example, against abortion. But not, against, for example, the economic, proposal that the party is making. So the use of Tea Party is not innocent in my view, or the lack of, referring to the Tea Party as hard right or far right, sends a message that in fact in the United States we don't have basically, these type of differences. All we need to do is to vote for candidates that in fact are going to benefit us individually, not as really as a collective. Then this process of selecting or selectively selecting, further denies the public with the appropriate vocabulary to name reality. References are made to the support of Ted Cruz receives from the Tea Party, for example, all the time, but you'll never find in the New York Times articles to refer to Ted Cruz as a hard right or a far right Republican presidential candidate. The erasure then of language to deny the public with the necessary tools to carry out critical analysis of political proposals is mostly obvious in the case of Donald Trump. While he embraced a far-right ideology based on racism, anti-immigrant xenophobia, Trump is never referred in the media as a far-right Republican presidential candidate who is gaining millions of votes through his racist, anti-immigrant, xenophobic political platform. It is naive to think, for instance, that reporters in the New York Times do not have far-right, center-right, moderate-right in their vocabulary toolbox. Of course they do. They do, in fact, have these terms in their vocabulary, but choose not to use them when referring only to U.S. politicians. However, they have no problem whatsoever marshalling these terms when writing about ideological difference, let's say, in France. Hence, one would find infinite references in the New York Times accurately using far-right when writing about Jean-Marie Le Pen. For example, Maggie Haberman from the New York Times, writing about Donald Trump, made the following observation. I quote, "The biggest surprise of the day may have been Mr. Trump receiving a supportive nod from Jean-Marie Le Pen, the far-right founder of the National Front in France, and who was tossed from the party over racially tinged rhetoric," unquote. While Jean-Marie Le Pen is characterized with the qualifier far-right, Trump is presented as Mr. Trump. So he doesn't have a position, right or left. He's Mr. Trump. So Mrs. Haberman's decision not to use the far-right qualifier is not innocent in my view. It is ideologically motivated to serve the purpose to de-skill further the voters in their analysis of each candidate they support or not support. Whereas all the left politicians all over the world are characterized as such by the US media outlets, right-wing politicians who share a center-right and far-right ideology are usually referred to as President so-and-so. Like, for example, you never found around 1973, when we blindly supported Chile, we supported Pinochet, you never find, at least I never found any reference to Pinochet, the president of Chile that did a coup d'etat against a elected socialist government, supported by the US. You never find a reference of Mr. Pinochet, the hard right, president. How is he referred often? He was referred Mr. Pinochet, the steel president, Mr. Pinochet, the hard, strong president, strong man, not really attaching hard right or far right to Pinochet. On the other hand, if you do a Google on Lula, the socialist president in Brazil, he is always referred to the leftist President Lula, as if you do the same thing for Cesar Chavez in Venezuela, he is always, accompanied by the qualifier, the leftist, Cesar Chavez, so on and so forth. So what I'm trying to argue with you, although we take it for granted, we don't even think about it, we don't even really critique, we don't even discuss, we don't even debate about these issues, the erasure of language in this context, in fact, send a political and ideological message, and have basically in the end, the effect of manipulating the way we think into believing that the world is not what we think it is, by not basically providing us with the critical tools to understand the difference between Donald Trump and Jeff Bush. There's a substantive difference between the two, even though both of them are conservative. And then the nomenclature that that is used in other political contexts in societies that you have multiple parties, including the communist parties and socialist parties, competing for power. It is necessary because the very existence of these parties demand it, and two, also people in their engagement with the political process, need points of reference to understand whether they are voting for a far-right candidate or they're voting for a far-left candidate or the center. What we try to do often is to create this illusion that it's all about the center. The more near the center you are, the safer you are, the better off the society is going to be. Not necessarily so, in my view. Thus, I would say that it is this right to a language that names reality that the oppressed need to reclaim in order to speak their worth. The right to be, I quote, the right to be themselves, to assume direction of their destiny, unquote. It is this right that the dominant forces go to great length to suffocate, seeking to sequester the words of the oppressed. Words that unveil the mechanism of oppression and are distorted or repressed, as Henry Giroux suggested, in, I quote, a society that revels in bouts of historical and social amnesia, in which it is much easier for a language of politics and community to be stolen and deployed like a weapon, so as to empty words such as democracy, freedom, justice, and social state of any viable meaning, unquote. To me, the sequestration of language by dominant forces of oppression and even liberal educators who proselytize about empowering minorities, even they represent, even when they represent the majority, in giving the minority voices, in giving them voices, when voice, we all know, should not be viewed as a gift, but voice is a democratic right, in my view, is also a human right. Voice is not something to be received as a gift. Voice is something to be struggled for. So in a sense, if I struggle to have a voice, I understand the processes of the struggle. If you give it to me as a gift, and you also, if you have the power to give me voice as a gift, you also retain the power to take it away in any moment that I say something that basically you find offensive, or you find obnoxious, or you find that you disagree with. Ultimately then, neoliberalism is then a reactionary discourse that leads human beings to fall into cynicism when confronted with the inescapable injustice, exploitation, and cruelty, and now unleashed under the banner of a new world order guided by new neoliberal policies and ironclad globalization, a globalization that, for example, guaranteed early on that Enron, a failed multinational company, highly corrupt, would achieve, I quote, profits that amount to 60% of India's entire rural development budget. A single American company was guaranteed profit equivalent to funds for infrastructure development for about 500 million people, unquote. Quoted by Roy. It is a fatalistic discourse that cynically asks people of the world to tolerate the fact that the US government, according to Roy again, enrich the 25,000 rich American farmers who currently divvy up $4 billion in government handouts every year, while 10 million poor cotton farmers in sub-Saharan Africa, where I come from, the world's poorest region, succumbed to the imposition of so-called free trade, which is in reality a nightmarish joke given the total lack of freedom embedded in the asymmetry of economic and power relationship among these nations. So then if you think of, when we hear terms like free trade, as we were discussing earlier on today with Henry and some other friends, it's nothing free, because Mexicans do not have any freedom in determining that they have to close their farmers, and their farmers have to try to cross the border illegally and then look for survival to live, in the United States because of the free trade, the NAFTA agreement. In fact, corn can be sold, American corn can be sold for less than would cost a family farmer, to plant and sell that corn. So there are issues that need to be debated, issues to be, unveiled and debunked and unpacked under what we seemingly think is a naive or innocent term such as free trade, freedom of speech, so on and so forth. I want to end, before I end, I want to say that the analysis that I did with the far right, center right, and so on, in terms of erasure of language, we have it with, for example, our La La Land myth that we live in a classless society in the United States. For that, we never, we deny. Academics continue to deny. All you have to do, Google in sociology, you see how many sociologists, with rare exception, you find sociologists that engage in class analysis. Very few. They're all into quantification. They're all dependent on positivist models of analysis, by and large. So, and if you insist on doing a class analysis, you're immediately, classified or labeled a Marxist, the left, not malcontent, and so on and so forth. So then we have, while saying that we don't have a class, we live in a classless society, in the 60s, the 70s, even early 80s, politicians used to talk that they were running their platform, running for office, is to really protect and help the working class. After, you know, the working class, you know, is becoming more and more powerless, you know, in the last two elections, beginning I think with Clinton, you know, or after Clinton, you know, the discourse, the political discourse that we need to run for office. I'm running for office to protect the middle class, because the middle class is losing its position, is losing its economic footing. You know, in fact, middle class, you know, kids cannot live in the neighborhood they were born and were raised, you know, often. I remember, you know, teaching and talking about this issue in class. This woman who had raised 5 children, lived in Brookline, a very, you know, affluent neighborhood near Boston, you know, and never said anything, but her body language, you know, showed that she was uncomfortable. So one day she told me, you know, I need to talk to you. I said, oh, fine, after class, you know, then we go to the hallway. She said, no, I need to talk to you. Can we go to your office? I said, oh, gosh, no, I don't know what she's going to do. She's going to say, you know, wants to send me back to Cape Verde, as I have been told many times. If I don't like it here, why don't I go back where I come from? That happened, you know, in Maine. And then we went up, and then she started talking. She says, you know, for the first 3 or 4 weeks, I was resisting your discourse. I was resisting your class. I was resisting you pushing us, you know. But you said something last class that got me to think. I said, what is it? He says, my husband, who is a medical doctor, retired medical doctor then, you know, we moved to Brookline from Jamaica Plain precisely to guarantee that our kids would get the best education. Brookline is well known for its quality education of its schools, you know. And I realized I have 5 children, and they all married, you know, so I have, you know, many grandchildren, and it saddens me, it bothers me, you know, the fact that my grandchildren, none of them can go to schools in Brookline. You know? Because now the children who were raised in Brookline schools in the affluent neighborhood, you know, don't have the jobs, you see, that will enable them to live in Brookline. So where did they live? They lived in Dorchester and Jamaica Plain, where the family had moved before to escape poor schooling. Do you see what I'm saying? So in other words, she for the first time realized that her class position, you see, you know, was being affected, and now she's bothered by it, but she never had the language to discuss because we don't have class in the United States. So from that day on, then the class, as far as she was concerned, became, much more engaging in that she understood that we do have class difference. So if progressive educators, they insist that we don't have, even when they insist that we do have class differences, you know, they continue to use euphemism. For example, we talk about working class, we talk about middle class, but we never, and if you find it, for example, maybe in Canada, but if you find it, for example, in, see you later, my dear. If you find it, for example, in the New York Times, you know, this label, you know, I'll take you out to dinner and I'll pay, you know, because you're not going to find. We never refer to the ruling class. We never refer to the upper class. But we insist that we live in a classless society, you know, while using the middle class and the working class, you know. So then the cycle, you know, the circle is not really completed, because we have working class, we have middle class, but what's missing? We have the ruling class. What is the ruling? What do we substitute the ruling class? What terms do we use to refer to the ruling class or to the upper class? The rich, the affluent, the well-to-do, you know, so on and so forth. The argument that I'm making, the very fact that we go through great lengths, even those in the academy, that, you know, sociologists, for example, or educators that do research, you know, and ignore the existence of the ruling class and prefer to move and to find euphemisms, you know, so as not to use the ruling class, you know, shows that in fact language matters, and that the absence of a particular vocabulary in certain political and ideological contexts, is a process through which we are manipulated through language to think, what we should, to think otherwise rather than thinking what we should be thinking. So the argument that I wanted to end with is that we have to pay attention to language, and if we are going to be critical, if we are going to be progressive, if we are going to present a plan towards social justice, a plan where, for example, there's less injustice and more democracy, we have to begin to name that reality, or at least create spaces, through language, where the people with whom we are in coalition, to form a movement, they have the necessary linguistic tools, to name their reality via their words, speaking their word, rather than borrowing the euphemisms given by the academic class that's already, in my view, sold out to the extent they refuse to. Even, for example, during the 2008, debacle, financial debacle, with all the discussion, would have been a fantastic opportunity to discuss class issues in the United States. We failed, even many of us progressive, because we bought into another euphemism. You see, rather than talking about the ruling class that in fact created, the economic meltdown, the bankers of Wall Street, they were the ruling class. What do? We talk about the 1%. By embracing the 1% uncritically, what we did, we basically lumped the 99% as living in a symmetrical economic world, which is not the case. Within the 99%, you have millions and millions of people that were lower class, working class, those that are not even counting what Henry calls disposable people. Then you have middle class that, well-to-do, making in the hundreds, in six figures a year, that you cannot compare the 6 figure a year, with somebody making 17,000 cleaning our house in our toilets. To end, let me just say that we cannot continue to deny that class exists. We cannot adhere or embrace a false discourse based on euphemism used by academics, that reinforce the false myth of a classless society, such as affluent, rich, well-to-do, and while avoiding the ruling class and the upper class. Where, for example, while the ruling class in New York, maybe the 43 individuals that control, so much wealth, more than 3 billion people in the world, spend millions of dollars every year to send their pets for pedicures in Paris, and their plants to winter in Florida. While millions and millions of children die of hunger almost every day and have lack of access to adequate health care throughout the world. While the ruling class is more interested in exploiting an unfair tax cut enacted by the far-right policies, cut that enlarged an already obscene gap of wealth. Over 12 million children in the United States go to bed hungry every single night. While the ruling class is buying in New York City a chocolate dessert for $27,000, the very restaurant that sells a chocolate dessert for $27,000 probably pays the dishwasher, a Latina, or some immigrant, less than $20,000, which means she can't even afford to pay rent to live in Manhattan, which means she's either homeless or she lives in shelters. So this is the type of contradiction that I think language contributes, to its hiding that I think need to be unpacked, unveiled, denounced, so we can announce a society that's more hopeful, a society that's less discriminatory, a society that's more humane and more humanized. Thus, the best course of action is to move away from the empty slogan, for example, of hope, and embrace Giroux's notion of an educated hope, which invariably implies a process of conscientization where as citizens we acquire the necessary critical thinking tools so that instead of internalizing oppression, we understand how institutions of power work to deny most people equality of treatment, access, and equity. Giroux's notion of educated hope invariably requires that we understand that we are agents who make history as we are also made by it. On that note, let me end by sharing the last verses of Maya Angelou's poem that captures the essence of meaning of history as hope, and then that basically clearly states and denies the impossibility of the impossibility of ending history as it has been suggested by many academics, political pundits, and people on the right, and sometimes even some liberals. And with that, I will quote her: "The horizon leans forward, offering you space to place new steps of change. Here on the pulse of this fine day, you may have the courage to look up upon me, to rock the river, the tree, your country. You may have the grace to look up and out into your sister's eyes, into your brother's face, your country, and say simply, very simply, with hope, good morning." And that's making history. Thank you. Gracias.